Tonight on Nation to Nation, a forensic anthropologist says finding the remains of two Indigenous women in a Winnipeg landfill should be possible.
If the women are there, the remains, there's a good chance that their remains are not destroyed, that they're there to be found.
The head of Aboriginal Legal Services says the Trudeau government missed an opportunity to change sentencing rules and keep Indigenous people out of prison.
We had hoped that they would do a more comprehensive look at mandatory minimum sentences, because I think we're stuck with the ones that we have, and those are not very helpful at all.
And a University of Ottawa professor says police continue to serve Indigenous women poorly.
We are over-policed when we're suspected of committing crimes. When Indigenous peoples are victims, they're under-policed.
Welcome to Nation. I'm Fraser Needham. The issue of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls has dominated the Canadian headlines in recent weeks, and in particular after a number of Indigenous women went missing in Winnipeg. The remains of two of these women, Morgan Harris and Mercedes Myron, are believed to be in the Prairie Green landfill. Police initially said it would not be possible to search the landfill, but have since changed course and are part of a feasibility study. Joining us today is Tracy Rogers, Director of the Forensic Science Program at the University of Toronto Mississauga. Mrs. Rogers, welcome to Nation to Nation.
Thank you.
I thought I might ask you, and I've covered a number of murder trials over the years, and when I've listened to forensic people like yourself, forensic anthropologists or pathologists, that it seems that remains are there infinitely. The problem is accessing them and or finding them where they are and accessing them. Is that an accurate statement?
That's fairly accurate. It takes quite a lot to completely destroy human remains, so they can withstand quite a lot, including fire and chemical damage and all sorts of things.
Right, and I guess the thing is, of course, there was 20 years time span in the Picton case, and there's been some delays even in this one, not as long, of course, but assuming that the police, obviously the families, everybody wants to do the right thing, find the remains, but often there's a long time that passes, or there's some, and you came in late on this. Is it, just from your dealing with things, is it a problem that maybe people are kind of, for lack of a better word, working in silos, that they're not often communicating with the forensic pathology community is not communicating with police and families, and there's, that there maybe could be a quicker way of doing these things, because often, as you know, in Picton, it was a very long period of time that passed before actually able to find these remains.
Yes, in hindsight, there's always more efficient ways of doing things. It's really about recognizing at the time what you need and where to find that information, and that can be really difficult in real time. One of the outcomes from some of the bigger cases in BC, including the Picton case, was a change in the way that they did homicide investigations, and including more interaction between the various local police agents, like the city police agencies. So that really helped when you're in areas where people can disappear in one spot and turn up deceased in another.
Okay, and I understand that you're working, of course, with Indigenous leadership on this particular file. What will you be helping them with, or what will you be advising them on?
Really, I'm there in a advisory capacity, in the sense that if they have questions about whether something is probable, is this a best approach, is there other ideas, other ways, those types of things, I'm happy to provide some suggestions and insight into things that worked or things that haven't worked in the past.
Okay, and then specifically looking as well at the Prairie Green landfill, we were aware there's a number of challenges there, as you would understand, as anyone would understand, I think, at a landfill. But what's your understand? What do you think, and for investigators, might in this particular case be some of the real main challenges that they're to finding remains that they may tackle?
Well, in the Picton case, we were dealing with objects in soil. So the soil itself was fairly uniform, and it was relatively easy to pick things out of soil. But in a landfill where you have a lot of different types of materials, everything really needs some attention. So you have to pay attention to every single thing that you're seeing, because there's not really a uniform background to pick things out of, right? So that will definitely be one of the challenges. And the other challenge will be ensuring that you have people who are able to identify what you're looking for, because there are so many things in a landfill, right? Just being able to recognize when something might be bone or something might be tissue, and needing to be able to pick that out from the background materials.
Okay, well, thanks for that. And one of the things that the police said at the press conference a few weeks ago was this difference between animal bones and human remains or bones, and that could overcomplicate doing a search. Can you maybe shed a little light on that for us?
Well, I guess for people that don't have experience with distinguishing animal from human bone, that could be challenging, but that's one of the main things that we do. So for us, for forensic anthropologists, when we pick up a bone, if it's a complete bone, it would be very easy to tell if it was animal or human. The complicating factor, I suppose, for forensic anthropologists at that scene would be that it would be a little bit time consuming to go through all of those bones and make sure that you're seeing animal bone and there isn't human bone mixed in there somewhere or covered by the animal bone.
Okay, and I guess the question, of course, that comes in all this, obviously the families really, of course, the community wants to find the remains. Everybody wants to do this, but the question everyone's talking about is this actually possible or not? And of course, they got the initial statement that it wasn't possible. Now they're doing a feasibility study. Are you able to give our viewers any indication of whether or not a search of this site to find these remains, because they are believed to be there, is likely possible or likely not possible, or how much hope or maybe reduced expectations should people have on this?
Well, based on information that's available now, it seems possible to do a search. It seems feasible to do a search. However, what's at stake is the amount of time and resources it would take to actually do that. The success of the search is a little bit of a different issue, because that really depends on how finely the search is able to go through things, through all those materials. If the women are there, the remains, there's a good chance that their remains are not destroyed, that they're there to be found. But the challenge will be in all of those materials that are surrounding them, and the clay that may be capping, and the challenges of simply getting to the right spot. So I would say that it is definitely possible to do the search. There's a chance that they can be found, and I think everyone agrees that if there's a chance that they can be found, then that chance needs to be taken.
Okay, well, thanks for shedding light on that. That's very interesting what you had to say, and once again, thanks for joining us today, Ms. Rogers. We'll have to leave it there, but we really appreciate your time.
You're welcome.
We'll be right back with Jonathan Rudin, Program Director for Aboriginal Legal Services, to talk about why the federal government's decision to leave some mandatory minimum prison sentences on the books is being criticized by Indigenous justice advocates. Welcome back. Indigenous women make up a staggeringly high number of Canada's prison population. Almost 50% of them are behind bars in federal prisons. Mandatory minimum prison sentences are believed to be driving these high numbers. Last month, the Trudeau government passed legislation eliminating some mandatory minimums, but left others on the books. Joining us today to talk about these high incarceration rates is Jonathan Rudin, Program Director of Aboriginal Legal Services in Toronto. Mr. Rudin, welcome to Nation to Nation.
Good to see you.
So as we know, Bill C-5 did eliminate some mandatory minimum sentences, but left others on the books, including those for murder, sexual offenses, and impaired driving. In your opinion, will this make a dent now in the very high number of Indigenous women that are filling our Canadian prisons?
Bill C-5 was a step forward, and we shouldn't ignore that, and an important step forward in that it not only eliminated some mandatory minimum sentences, but it allowed for conditional sentences, which are sentences that would otherwise be jail sentences but served in the community. And those are really valuable options. And we certainly see that for clients that we're writing Gladue reports for, more and more of them are getting conditional sentences. So that's a positive step. But overall, I think Bill C-5 was a missed opportunity. This is really Parliament's only chance to address criminal law. And we had hoped that they would do a more comprehensive look at mandatory minimum sentences, because I think we're stuck with the ones that we have, and those are not very helpful at all.
Okay, and sometimes when you talk, these are, of course, they are serious offenses, and sometimes when maybe you approach a person on the street and you say something like, like a mandatory minimum for something like murder, well, maybe that's not a bad thing. But, of course, we know through this issue that it's not necessarily Indigenous, doesn't serve Indigenous women, perhaps, all that well. But maybe you can just give our viewers a sort of a concrete example of how this type of mandatory minimum may actually harm, both society and that Indigenous woman that ends up serving the mandatory minimum.
So one of the things that happens with mandatory minimums, because they are so serious, take the mandatory minimum for first-degree murder, which is 25 years, it often encourages people to plead guilty to other offenses that they might in fact have a defense to, but they don't want to take the chance that they might lose. And so people plead guilty to things that they're not actually guilty of. And this leads to a phenomenon that's been recognized by the courts, particularly this year, of something called false guilty pleas. It's hard for people to think, why would you plead guilty to something you didn't do? But it happens all the time. And one of the reasons is because someone's told, okay, look, if you go to trial and you lose, you could go to jail for 25 years. If it's second-degree murder, you could go to jail for 10 years. So minimize your risk and please plead guilty to manslaughter. And so people are going to jail for things that they didn't do, and they're going to jail for long periods of time. And certainly for Indigenous women, they're often then losing their families, and this is perpetuating the dislocation that Indigenous women have from their families and, their parents and their grandparents. It's not a good situation at all, and it's making a bad situation worse.
Okay, and just very briefly on that, too, did you want to say anything about a situation, I suppose, of domestic abuse and self-defense that may happen in perhaps a situation Indigenous women may be in rather than the general public?
Yes, certainly we see cases where women, and particularly Indigenous women, respond to violence that's perpetrated upon them by essentially self-defense, but sometimes what is seen as self-defense, or from their perspective as self-defense, is not seen by the courts as self-defense, because they may stab or shoot the person who's abusing them when that force, according to the law, was not at that moment necessary. There is a defense. There is what's called the battered woman's defense, which is available, but it's not easy to be successful with. And so again, women in that situation often plead guilty to offenses that they didn't do. And of course, for Indigenous people, this is all made worse by the fact that there's not a huge amount of trust or faith in the justice system anyway. And so for many people, the fact that they've been charged is really just, okay, I've been charged, I know where this is going. And Crowns are not always as careful as they should be about making sure they have all the elements of the charges proven. And defense lawyers often don't always mount all the defenses they can for people. And so all those systemic factors that Indigenous people face in the criminal justice system are magnified, and again, particularly for Indigenous women who are responding to crimes of violence.
Okay, and I know I interviewed you last month at the time that the legislation was passed, and you said you were disappointed but not necessarily surprised. Could you explain that a bit for our viewers?
Sure. You mentioned off the top the three sort of mandatory minimums that were not touched: mandatory minimums for impaired driving, murder, and sexual offenses. And those are crimes that are incredibly serious, obviously, and that the public does not have a lot of tolerance for. And again, it's understandable. I mean, impaired driving causes huge amounts of carnage. Sexual offenses, we know the harm that they cause, and murder is the most serious thing that can happen to someone. And so when you say to people, well, we don't want mandatory minimums for those offenses, people go, well, why not? I mean, these are the worst of all people. And I think what Canadians don't know generally is that the people who commit these offenses have done very bad things at that moment, but it doesn't mean they're bad people. And it also doesn't mean that we are best served by locking people up for long periods of time. Certainly, the sort of healing that people need to do who, for example, offend sexually, many people who offend sexually have been sexually abused themselves. Are they going to get the sort of healing or the help that they need while they're in jail? It is not clear that happens.
Okay, well, we're going to have to end it there. But once again, Mr. Rudin, as always, thanks for joining us today.
It was good talking with you.
Up next, we'll have University of Ottawa professor Veldon Coburn joining us to talk about missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls and how it is affecting Ottawa's Inuit community. We'll be right back after these short messages. Welcome back. It's been more than 6 years since Annie Putugu's body was pulled from Ottawa's Rideau River. In the fall of 2021, the remains of another Inuit woman, Mary Papatsy, were found in the city's Vanier neighborhood. And more recently, yet another Inuit woman, Savannah Pikakuk, was found dead in the city's West End. A 33-year-old man has been charged with first-degree murder in her death. And joining us today to talk about the issue of missing and murdered Inuit women is University of Ottawa political science professor Veldon Coburn, who is also the adopted father of Putugu's 10-year-old daughter, Napachi. So thanks very much for joining us today, Mr. Coburn.
It's a pleasure. Thank you for having me, Fraser.
So I thought I would first start with the death of Savannah Pikakuk, and that happened earlier this year in September, I believe, and of course another Inuit woman that died in the city. I guess with your sort of relationship sort of with the community and also having with your adopted daughter, what was going through your mind when you heard that she had been killed earlier this year?
Well, it seems to be a very disproportionate number of Inuits dying, well, being murdered or going missing here in the city without much police response. The other Indigenous, Inuit woman was Mary Papatsy. That was her remains after 5 years of disappearance were discovered pretty much just on the doorstep, almost in plain sight, in a little sort of area of Ottawa, Vanier, where Inuit tend to congregate. Outside of Nunavut, Ottawa has the largest Inuit population because of the transportation and they bring down companions for health reasons as well, and then they settle down here. But they do congregate in an area called Vanier, and it was right there in a sort of construction site that Mary Papatsy's remains were found in the back sort of yard, right off a very busy street. And then so other Indigenous women and Inuit women have been missing or murdered, and without very much effort, or at least public effort by the Ottawa Police Services to bring about any sort of remedy.
Okay, and I'm just going to move now to the death of Annie Putugu. As you know, of course, it's an unsolved case. Lots of questions still remain. I don't think anyone's been charged, or the police, as far as I know, don't have any suspects. I guess I'll ask you quite honestly, do you think the police have done their job on this case?
Sort of at the outset, I would have had some assurances because I did have some discussions with them within the first year, but communications really dropped off. Perhaps part of it is my own efforts to communicate with them, but I do remain in touch with them now and then. I've had discussions in previous leadership with Chief Charles Bordelot, and then I did have a little bit of a relationship with last interim chief who sat in after the removal of Chief Peter Slowly, who was sort of unceremoniously removed after the convoy. Discussions about the matter, but does it trickle down to those that are within the major crimes units that It's unsure to me. In the recent years, it leaves a lot to be desired as well. And at this particular point, I don't really have a whole lot more faith going forward, particularly with the selection of the new police chief that has a pretty unseemly history with Indigenous peoples.
What are some of the things you think that maybe the police could do to improve this situation?
Well, it's sort of difficult to say because it's hard to go into it. It almost seems very self-evident of what they should be doing, but why they won't do it, particularly in the case, and it seems very unseemly with what's going on in Winnipeg, is that it's a stark matter, and they had to have their arms twisted just to do the very bare minimum. Something that we understand as Indigenous peoples, that the so-called justice system, where the face-to-face every day starts with the police before you even make it to courts or corrections. But the police themselves tend to, as Indigenous people, as we know pretty much, and it's not very much anecdotal, like we can look at all academic studies and say that we are over-policed when we're suspected of committing crimes, and just even during our regular everyday, as we are suspects of some sort of criminality, and thus we're subject to heightened police suspicion. Like, even if, having been living in Saskatchewan, for example, if you're Indigenous, if you go into public spaces, like be a mall or a large big box store, even the sort of, private security guards place them under heightened suspicion. However, when Indigenous peoples are victims, they're under-policed. They are treated as less than deserving of the resources that are normally dedicated, or at least ought to be equitably dedicated towards the protection and security of their lives. So when they go missing and when they're murdered, it seems like the police services across the country are not willing, and it doesn't just seem like it, but we know as a fact that the distribution of police resources is comparatively disproportionate for non-Indigenous populations. They seem to receive priority when they are victims rather than Indigenous peoples. And the really unseemly message that the Winnipeg police seem to say to us is that when you're victims and you're tossed into the garbage, that's where the police will let you stay. And it's still a very difficult and bitter pill to swallow.
Absolutely, and obviously a very complex issue, as you know, and something that I think society as a whole will be grappling with in the months ahead. But we're going to have to leave it there. But thanks very much again, Mr. Coburn, for joining us today.
Thanks, Fraser. Thanks for having me.
And that wraps up this week's episode of Nation to Nation. And it is also the last show for 2022. On behalf of all of our staff at APTN, we want to thank you for watching the show this year, and have a safe and happy holiday season. I'm your host, Fraser Needham. Good night.